Welcome to lecture number 5 of the Kuzari. I know people are following in various versions. The page numbers right now in this version, the Rabbi Korobkin translation, we're on page 73, about to read item number 40. So that would be the first essay, paragraph number 40, as they're numbered, and that's pretty standard. So whichever edition you're in, that's where we're up to. Right now, we are in this lengthy conversation between the Kuzari, which was, when we talk about the Kuzari, we're referring to the king of the Khazars, and the Chaver, which is the rabbi who he's asking about Judaism. And remember, again, the Kuzari is trying to find the right way to live, and he didn't like what the Christians had to say. He didn't like what the Muslims had to say. So now he is talking to the rabbi, and the rabbi, instead of answering him with the basic philosophy of Judaism, like what's the bottom line things that we believe in, instead he answered by giving him a brief history of Judaism, a brief history of Moshe and they receiving the Torah, and our relationship with God, Yetziat Mitzrayim, leaving Egypt, and so on and so forth. So the Kuzari at first was a little bit like, what are you telling me stories for? And I wanted to know your philosophy, right? And remember, his focus here is on a philosophy that justifies a certain way of life, right? He doesn't want to just know a philosophy. He wants to know a philosophy that explains why I should live a certain way, why I should practice a certain way. So then the Kuzari says, hold on, and I'll explain that to you. And we're in the middle of doing that. So we left kind of in the middle of a conversation where the Chaver, the rabbi, was telling the Kuzari, it was showing how in all the creations in the world, starting from the domain, starting from things like rocks and earth that don't have life, leading all the way up to plants and animals, and then humans eventually, there are different levels of creatures on this world, and humans being on the highest level. This was a typical way of thinking in medieval times, and of placing human beings at the top of the pyramid of creatures that exist because of our capacity to think, our intellect. So now the Kuzari, the Chaver says, well, who's above the human beings, right? What level is that above human beings? And in number 39, so in number 38, the Kuzari said, intelligent people, wise people, the Chachamim, the sages, right? They're above the human beings. And the Chaver said, no, they're not really above human beings. They're just human beings that happen to be a little smarter than other human beings. Obviously, there's going to be variation. In lions, some lions are bigger and stronger than other lions. In human beings, some humans are smarter than, or taller or whatever, than other human beings. But that's not a separate category. That's where we left off last time. So then in number 40, the Kuzari says, yeah, you know what? You're right. There, after human beings, there's nothing left in creation that's above the level of a human being. So now the Chaver, we're about to read item 41. The Chaver, and remember, I'm reading from Michael Schwartz. Hold on one second. I have to turn off my AC because it's. I'm going to pause the recording for a second. Yeah, I'm sorry. The AC it takes a minute to go off. So if you hear a noise in the background, it's going to go off in a minute. But so the Chaver in item number 41, and again, I was just telling you I'm reading for the Hebrew from Schwartz, but you can follow along in the English, starting at the top of page 74. So the Chaver answered, the rabbi answered as follows, right? What if, and this reminds me a lot, it's in the news recently, like a month or 2 or 3 ago, the Superman movie came out. And there was a lot of talk about how Superman was a Jewish invention, right? Which just happens to be true. There's a lot of Jewish history behind the development of superheroes in general. And it comes from, mostly young teenage Jewish boys who felt disenfranchised. They felt like they were at the bottom of the heap. And they imagined what it would be like if we had a superpower and we could, and use that superpower for good, and we would, right? So he's about to talk about a Superman right now. So the idea of Superman kind of goes back all the way 1,000 years to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. So the Chaver said, okay, it went off, so hopefully the sound got a little better. So the Chaver said, the rabbi said, Im nimtza adam hanichnas leish ve'einu mazikalo. Let's say you found the guy who was able to go into a fiery furnace and not get damaged. But he was able to live for such a long time without eating any food. And there was a light surrounding him that eyes couldn't even tolerate such eyes. People had to look away. You couldn't tolerate it. He didn't get sick. And no matter how old he was, he retained his strength. When it was time for his life to end, he died of choice. Just like any one of us might go to bed at night to sleep, he went to bed to pass away. Right? He knew this was his time, this was his day. He went, he lay down, and he passed on. In addition to knowing all kinds of things that other people in the world didn't know, things that were hidden from everyone else. He had an understanding of history, things that happened in the past, and he had an understanding of what the progress of history, the opposite of history, of the future history was going to be. This is more than just another a human being that happens to be better than others, but rather this is a human being that's in a different level. This is like a different category altogether. So Amar Kuzari, Achen, Darga Zos Elohis Malachis. This is like an angelic, a godly creature, if there is such a thing, right? This is a different thing. This is something. This is a godly matter. That's a different type of thing altogether. It's not a natural thing. It's not an intellectually understandable thing. This is a different category. This is something else. I want to remind you that over here, for those of us that did study Rambam with me, when Rambam described the levels of philosophy, the levels of prophecy, right? And the Rambam categorically did not categorize a prophet as being a different type of creature. He categorized all of us as having a little bit of prophecy within us, or having that. As we work on ourselves, we can go up in levels until we reach that level of access to the divine wisdom, right? Which is something. So it was it was a gradual thing that we can step up the ladder to achieve that high level. And Moshe Rabbeinu was able to achieve the highest level. Here, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is presenting this in a very different way. I'm going to point out differences between the two of them, because that's one of the purposes in me learning this book after learning that book. So you should understand the different types of philosophies that they were teaching. So Omar HeChaver. So the Chaver answered, I'm in item number 43 now, right? What I'm describing is some of the descriptions of the prophet that nobody argues over whether or not Moses was this type of prophet. Through Moses, right? It was revealed to everyone, right? That godliness was something that was attached to them, right? In other words, their relationship with God was revealed through Moshe. Through Moshe, it was revealed that there was a God for these people, right? That leads them in the way that he wants to lead them. Depending upon whether or not they obey God's commands or rebel against God's commands. Hugila Nistaros, he revealed secrets, he revealed things that people did not know. And he described to us, right? This is with the understanding that Moshe taught us the whole Torah, including Genesis, including the creation of the world. He taught us that the world was created, right? At this time in history, one of the big problems in philosophy was the world created, like the religious people taught, versus the philosophers who said that the world had always existed, right? And we discussed this several times. So Moshe brought the idea of Chidush Olam, that the world was created from nothing. And he taught us all about the history of the people before the flood, right? V'ketzad hisyachasu el Adam Harishon, how they descended from the first person, the human being, Adam. V'yichos shivim ha'umos, and he told us about the 70 nations of the world, acharei hamabel, right? That came about after the flood. All of them descending from Shem, Cham, and Yefes, for the three sons of Bnei Noach, the three sons of Noach, right? V'ketzad niflugu halashonos, and how the different languages came to be, ve'efo shachnu, and where they lived, v'ketzad notzru hamalachos v'dibnu arim, and how the different types of trades were learned, because the Torah tells us how this one developed music, and this one developed farming, and this one developed weapons, and so on. And this one developed works of metal, and how they built cities. And it lists out the years of history all the way from the beginning. Remember, the Kuzari is talking, and Yehuda Levi is speaking in a time when the historicity of the Bible was not under attack, right? In other words, you and I, if you or I were to meet up an atheist today, right, you couldn't make this argument, because they would come at you and say, well, all that history is not true, right? In other words, because today they have reasons to tell you the world isn't 6,000 years old, and the world, and this isn't how languages came to be, and so on and so forth, right? But Yehuda Levi is speaking in a time when these things were not under question. So he had no reason to assume that these were not historical, right? The scientific. So we have to understand that as we read through the next, pretty much all of today, maybe even next time we study together, and we'll have to talk about when that's going to be, because the holiday's coming up, right? We have to understand that Yehuda Levi is talking in a time when these things were not under question, right? The question was, do you believe the Islamic version or the Christian version or the philosophical version of events, right? But nobody questioned, right? So when we see in the Torah this history, right? And what I'm going to try to do at some points, I want to read Yehuda Levi for what Yehuda Levi says 100%. That's the main purpose of us studying together. But I will fill in, what would a person today say to make a similar argument to a person today? Like if you or I were to meet someone in the street, arguments that if you read the Kuzari to them today, they would laugh off half of this stuff, right? We have to understand, right? So how would you present the main thrust of his argument today without resorting to saying that, well, look, the Torah tells us the history of the flood? Because if you said that today, obviously someone who doesn't believe in the Torah will laugh you off. What do you mean the flood? It's a bunch of nonsense. There never was a flood, and so on and so forth, right? So you can't, but I will present some possible ways to do that. In the meantime, I do want to first absorb what Rabbi Yehuda Levi is saying through the Chaver, right? What the rabbi is telling the Kuzari. So I'm going to stick to that. So I'm about to do item number 44, which is on page 75 in the Korobkin version. So Amar Kuzari, so the Kuzari was immediately astounded. He said, "Mafli sheyesh lachem minyan shanim umas b'rias ha'olam," right? It's pretty wild. It's crazy. It's wonderful that you guys actually have an accounting, a number from the time of creation, right? That's pretty wild, right? So you guys really have a handle on ancient history that nobody else in the world has. Now, right now, I'm going to go off on that tangent for a second. I want to give you a sense for how I look at this, right? Because obviously, anyone, I'm not going to argue that our accounting from BSO and from creation is accurate. There are those that want to take a literal interpretation of the Bible and do that, but that's not me, right? I don't think the world. I believe that the world was created, right? Because the Torah teaches that, but just as the Rambam told us when we studied the Rambam, that Masa Bereshis, Genesis is not meant to be a literal historical description. So if that's true, so how would I present a similar argument which is grounded in modern, right, with the modern scientific knowledge and historical and archaeological knowledge and geological, et cetera, knowledge that we have today? So what I'm going to argue as we go through this is something along the following lines, and I might need some help from you guys as we go through it. And that is that it's pretty. Look at our history as a people and the history of our ideas and how our ideas have influenced the entire world around us, right? And our traditions going all the way back to times thousands and thousands of years back, right? And these things are corroborated by modern history and archaeology and books and so on. If we look, the influence that the ideas that were introduced by the Torah have had on the world around us are profound. There isn't a single are profound beyond words. There isn't a single advance in human history that hasn't been directly influenced by the ideas introduced by the Torah. I mean, look around you. Anyone that thinks about the importance of not abusing, people that are oppressed, the freedom from slavery. These are ideas that are ingrained in the Torah. The idea of Exodus, the wonderful freedom that we achieved from Paro, right? That one nation shouldn't subjugate another nation. The idea of beating our swords into plowshares, the idea of treating the neighbor like thyself, the ideas of are so deeply ingrained in everything and in our history. And when we look back through our history, we look back at our history, the countries and nations and sovereignty and temples that we built in the years past, in centuries past, in millennium past, and how when we lived properly, when we had a tremendous influence, a tremendous positive influence on the world. When we went the wrong way, we unfortunately suffered terrible, terrible suffering and destruction, and so on and so forth. And our ideas became so powerful that two major world religions swallowed up our ideas completely and promulgate the good ones, at least, as their own, right? The influence that we've had. So in other words, if I were going to make an argument, and look at how we look back at our history, whatever each person here, whether you're, wherever you and your ancestors come from, even if you've converted to the religion, all right, but you come with such a long story behind you. We look back at generation after generation after generation in ways that, think about friends that you encounter from almost any other ethnic group. I'm not saying that of course, many other groups have long histories and long stories and have a lot of contributions, but ours is so unique and so special. And so if we were going to present an argument, right, today, right, remember at the time the Kuzari is being written, Rabbi Yehuda Levi had no reason to suspect that the world was more than 6,000 years old, right, or in his case 5,400 years old. We'll see in a minute, right? But remember that the same underlying idea is very relevant today, even if the science that he's about to present to us in the next several pages might not be relevant anymore. I hope that resonates a little bit, and try to think about that as we go through this. Otherwise, you can get very turned off by some of the things that he says, right? Because a lot of the things that he says don't work anymore, right? If you take them at face value. But if you take them for the depth of what he's really trying to say, then they do have a lot of resonance even today. So Amar HaChaver. So the Chaver answers, this is item 45, or paragraph 45. I don't know what the right word is. Yeah, because we calculate our years based on creation of the world, which is important, which is an important idea. Why do we count to the creation of the world as opposed to what other religions count from time of Muhammad or from the time of Jesus, right? They picking a certain event, right? But we ground ourselves in the entire history of the universe. We don't ground ourselves in one particular person or one particular event. Not even in Moshe, who we just mentioned before how great he was. We don't ground our religion in Moshe. We ground our religion in the entire history of the world, right? This is what the Kuzari is trying to tell us here, right? So, or rather, not the Kuzari, because that's what we're calling the Khazar king, but that's what the book Rabbi Yehuda Levi is trying to tell us. We count from the beginning. You can talk to the Jews that live in Khazaria in your own kingdom, all the way to the Khuzars that live in Abyssinia. Chabosh is Abyssinia, which is some sort of it's an empire or nation that once existed somewhere in the range of Ethiopia. So he was talking about the Jews all the way from the Jews of Ethiopia to the Jews of Khazar. We all are keeping the same number. Now, this is something that is relevant today. The traditions that have been retained by our people, no matter how far and flung and scattered we've been, right? All the way from, yes, Ethiopia to Khazaria to God knows where else, right? We've been retaining these traditions and maintaining this relationship, which is something incredibly special and incredibly unique. There is no other comparison to anything like this in the world, right? I'm not aware. If anyone can correct me, please do so. But I'm not aware of any other people that has this kind of history and that grounds itself in world history, grounds itself in the creation of the world. Okay, if that's true, so what's the number, right? What's the year? So Amar Chaver, the Chaver answered, Arbat alafim b'chamesh mios. It's 4,500. I'm sorry, I said 5,000. 4,500. So because remember, he's writing this in somewhere around, I don't know, I guess around 4,900, maybe 5,000 no, or somewhere in according to the Jewish counting. But he was writing this as if it was happening 400 years before his time, somewhere in the year 700 something. Whether or not the actual conversation with the king of Khazar, if it even ever happened at all, occurred during that year is not relevant. But that's when he's presenting it as if it happened. So that's the year. Perutan Mavor Mechayadim. How do we know this? Because we look at the history of Adam, the first human, Shes Enosh. We can count down the years. His child Shes, his child Enosh, all the way at Noach. Shem Va'ever at Avram. Then we count the generations from Noach all the way to Abraham. Yitzchak Yaakov at Moshe. We can count through the generations from Avram to Yitzchak to Yaakov all the way to Moshe. All of Hashalom, blessed, rest him, peace be upon him. Elahim b'shel dveikusam hagarin shel adam muskulaso. These, because of their attachment, meaning here their attachment to God, right? These are the main seed, the seed of humanity. This is the ones that maintained this relationship with God the whole time. Was that line that I just read to you? So they're like the seed within the shell. The shell is everyone else, right? They all had many children. Those are like the shell. Now, remember, he's telling you here something that's very deep, right? He's telling you that this tradition, this relationship, this special relationship with God was passed through certain people from generation to generation, and only some of their children inherited that special, unique relationship. The rest were like klipos, were like shells, right? That could have a lot of meanings depending on how you spin that in your mind. I'm not going to tell you how to spin it, but I'm just telling you what he says. Heim lo damul avos, the ones that were like shells, they weren't. Why were they like shells? Because they weren't like their fathers. So this godly relationship, this godliness that was unique to those individuals that passed it from generation to generation, wasn't retained by all of these other people, right? Minyan hashonim nikva al pi Elohim. So the years, as I said before, are fixed based on Elohim, those that are godly people, those that have the special spark of godliness, right? This is the origin of the idea that there's a special spark of godliness within every Jew. It's something that many of you probably heard if you go to Chabad, or they'll talk to you about the spark of Judaism. Where do you think it comes from? This is where it comes from. You won't find it in the Gemara. You'll find it here, right? That whole idea that there's a special spark of holiness within each Jew, this is the origin of that idea. I'm pointing these things out to you because I want you to understand the incredible, profound influence that this book has had on Jewish thought to this day. Like underlying almost everything that you think is basic Judaism goes back to these books that we're studying together, right? We studied together Rambam, and we're studying together Kuzari. This is where it comes from. It was spun through all kinds of other Kabbalistic works and thought works and so on and so forth for years and centuries afterwards. But this is the origin of these ideas. And that's why I think it's so important for us to learn these texts together. I want you to know and understand where our belief system comes from. And that's why I'm giving these lectures, so that you get it from the source. Okay. These were small individuals, right? A few individuals. They were not large groups. Until Yaakov gave birth to 12 tribes. All 12 were worthy of inheriting this special godly spark. So now all of a sudden, instead of it being individual to individual, now it became a congregation. Now it became a group. And it's through them, that we have retained the counting of years to creation. Minyan Hashanim shel mi shekodam, right? Yesh lanu mipi Moshe v'anu yodim mashim Moshe ad halom, right? Everything that happened prior, we know because Moshe told us, right? And from Moshe on, we know because we've been counting since then, right? Okay, so that's item number 47. If at any point somebody wants to jump in and ask or comment or say, please just either raise your hand or just unmute yourself and talk, because there's a lot there's a lot here. But Omar Kuzari, I'm doing item 48, which is on the bottom of page 76 in the Korobkin. If you're following me in the English or the Hebrew in the Korobkin version. Again, it's not going to be the same Hebrew that I'm reading because I'm reading from a modern Hebrew translation. The one you have in the Korobkin is the traditional one from the 11th century Hebrew translation, but they're all good. So Amar Kuzari, says the Kuzari, Peirut ze marchik es hachashad hara midvar chazav kanunya. This explanation shows me that it's highly unlikely that there's any trickery or lies going on here. There's truth here. Okay, now I wanted to think, like, because I'm going to melt this down. Obviously, today, most of us, myself included, don't really look at those generations in Bereshit as being literally, exactly the years that so-and-so lived for 900 so on years, because of what the Rambam said and because we learned that together. However, that's not the point here, right? What the Kuzari is saying is that this ancient tradition that's been going on for so long, right? And that's such an integral part of all Jewish people scattered all across the world, right? Is something that has to be truth to it, right? It doesn't make sense that somebody just sat down and made it all up and made up this lie. There has to be some truth to this special relationship. There has to be some meaning behind it, right? If there was just a conspiracy, right? If it was just protocols of elders of the Zion style thing, where a couple of guys sitting around in a smoky room and thinking how we're gonna make up a whole bunch of nonsense, right? Then someone's gonna reveal the secret, right? If you're all just making us come with some Yishalu Estvarav, or someone will get up and say, nah, it's not true, right? Right? So Kol Shekain Hamonim Gedolim, but here you have all these groups of people, so many communities all around the world that are all transmitting that same tradition, one generation to the next generation to the next, and so on. So many people all around. There has to be truth to this relationship. There has to be meaning to this. It can't have just came about poof by a couple of wise guys trying to make up some nonsense. Because if that was the case, it never would have stayed. It wouldn't have staying power. And again, I'm going to modernize this thought process a little bit and tell you, right? The staying power of Judaism is monumental. It's there's nothing like it in the world. You can't compare it to anything. There is no tradition. There is no culture that has managed throughout all of what we have lived through, and all of our disparate groups and different people from different countries and different languages, hundreds of years separate, still managed to maintain this tradition and this way of life. And this special relationship with God is unique and special, and it's unprecedented. And it doesn't just happen because somebody made it up. Now think about it. There's a hint here, because remember, the other two religions were exactly that. Somebody made it up, right? You can pick whether it's Jesus or Muhammad or Jesus' few disciples, right? The Kuzari is saying this for a reason. He's saying it wasn't just 10 people. He's thinking of, I don't know how many apostles, 12 apostles, right? There wasn't 12 people that hung out together and said, we're going to make up a new religion, right? Because but it doesn't make sense. That wouldn't have the kind of staying power that Judaism has and has demonstrated to have throughout history. So now I'm about to hit number 49. So 49 is on page 77 in the Korobkin. So the Chaver says, Nachon, you're right. It's this kind of relationship is something that's special, something that it must have truth to it. There must be meaning behind it. It must have something real about it. So here he goes again onto something which you and I, like nowadays, we know a lot more about the origins of languages and the history of the development of language than they knew then, right? So, but remember, Rabbi Yehuda Levi is writing in a time when they had no reason to assume that the account in Bereshit was literal, right? Remember, Rambam taught us in Moreh Nevuchim that when we encounter something in the Torah, right, that contradicts what we know to be true through knowledge and science, then in those cases, the way we have to interpret the Torah is as a metaphor that is teaching us an idea that's true, but the actual historical event is not meant to be history. That's how the Rambam approached it. Rabbi Yehuda Levi is speaking where he's under the assumption and that the story of the origin of language as related in the Torah is true. He had no reason not to believe that. He didn't have the kind of research that we now have today. So you have to understand when he says that, he's coming from that perspective, right? So Avraham was around during the time of the Dar HaFlaga when they were building the Tower of Babylon, and eventually it ended up being Babel, and people were just talking all kinds of languages. Hu krovav himshichu ledaber b'lashon Ever Savo. He continued to speak the original language, which was called the language of Aver, the language of Hebrew. Ivri, that's the origin of the word Hebrew, right? L'chein nikra Ivri, that's why he was called the Ivri, Avraham the Hebrew, right? Because he spoke the Hebrew language. 400 years later, Moses came by, now, but at this point, by 400 years later, the world was now full so many times over with many people, b'shlita, with all kinds of ideas of governments and chachmos and wisdoms and hashememios, ideas about the heavens and artios and ideas and science about the land. That the world had advanced so much farther by the time Moshe came along, and with all kinds of ideas and philosophies and religions and sciences and so on, right? So Huba el Paro. So in this world where you have all these conflicting knowledges, and to a small degree, I think this reflects real history in the fact that, in the original time in Babylon, right, you had just the early times of the early civilizations that arose in the Mesopotamian region. By the time of the Exodus in Egypt, you already have the Egyptian Empire, you have the empires that are being built in south of that. In Ethiopia, you have empires across. Empires are probably not the right word, but states that are starting to arise with more sophisticated religions, more sophisticated languages, more sophisticated ways of writing. Right, so it's a time when people are moving forward. The timeline and exactly how many years in between this and this might not be exact, but the idea that Rabbi Yehuda Levi is pushing out here has certainly basis in real history, right? So Moshe comes to Paro, right? During Moses comes to Pharaoh during the time when the world now has all these competing ideas, a lot of different deities, a lot of different philosophies, a lot of different ways of life, a lot of different languages, right? It's no longer the time when there was, one language, all of a sudden everyone's running around, where there was just one city and everyone left, right? Because they were confused. So he comes to Paro, and at this time, Chachmei Mitzrayim, Chachmei Bnei Yisrael, the wise men of both Egypt and the wise men of Israel, Sha'amdu Kenegdo, that were standing opposite Moshe, and he's trying to teach them this new idea. No, we have a special relationship with God. This is one God. There's not many gods. There's a creator. The world hasn't been around forever, right? And there's this special relationship that we have, right? So they had to They had to search out Moshe's actions and see, is this guy for real, right? Should we believe him? Is he telling us what's for real? They said, God is speaking to you. How do we know? How do we know that God is speaking to you, right? How do we know that you're bringing a message from God? Maybe you're making it up. There's all kinds of charlatans. Nowadays, in other words, in their day, everybody's getting up and claiming, I'm the God, he's the God, they're a God, I'm the best God, you're the best God. Everyone has their thing. How do we know that you're just not another guy claiming that you have your thing, right? Until God came with the Aseret HaDibrot, until that point, and Rabbi Yehuda Levi is making an interesting argument over here, that the people throughout Yetziat Mitzrayim were still not 100% convinced, right, that this is true until they heard Aseret HaDibrot, that known as the 10 Commandments, better translated as the 10 sayings of God. Now, at its face value, we heard it from God himself, so now there's no doubt anymore, right? But it's more than that. It's deeper than that. It's not just that we heard from, I know that it might sound to, what do you mean just here? When you hear God speaking, that's pretty darn big, right? But it's much more than that. Look at the content of the Aseret HaDibros. It's the content of the Aseret HaDibros that teaches you that this is real, right? The incredible humility. What does God do, right? When he tells us, he says, I am your God, right? That took you out of Egypt, right? So why do I have a relationship with you? Because I saved you from this terrible calamity that you're in. In other words, I provide for you. I do, right? And I don't want you to have any other gods. Immediately afterwards, right? He tells you, honor your father and your mother, right? He tells you to treat, to not to steal, not to kill, not to commit adultery, right? Live a decent, basic a life, right? This God is not like all the other gods. He doesn't say in Aseret HaDibrot, it doesn't even say anything about sacrifices. He doesn't say anything about what God wants from you. He tells us about how we're supposed to live a good, decent, proper life. That's convincing, right? All of a sudden, we hear the Aseret HaDibros. Now we know that it's not Moshe. Moshe didn't get up and somehow play a trick and give us Aseret HaDibros and tell us Moses is the greatest guy in the world. Moses is the greatest king. Moses deserves to get riches and give him all your gold, like all the other guys in those days did. That's what Pharaoh did. That's what all the other guys did. But Moshe didn't do that. He took them to Har Sinai, where we heard the fundamental basis of basic morality that affects us and influences us to this day. And then the people said, oh, Moshe, so he's not just one of those other guys. He's got something else to teach us. He's got something special to teach us, right? This is real. This is the real deal, right? And so that's why they were in doubt until they stood in front of Har Sinai. So, and in the Hebrew that I'm looking at, Adasher Shmialam et Peniyato, right? Until he taught them what his leanings were, Aseret HaDibrot, with the Aseret HaDibrot. How, in other words, where is he heading with this? Right? It would be the best translation of that, right? And that I could think of, right? Where is Moshe turning? Lifnot is to turn. Where is Moshe aiming at, right? When he's giving us or bringing us to the Mount Sinai to hear from God. He's not aiming at his own gratification. He's not aiming at getting himself out of trouble. He's not aiming at giving himself the Nobel Peace Prize, right? He's aiming at bringing us to living a proper and better life. That's when they were convinced that Moshe was the real deal. Kach nohag amo klapav lo mitoch bor. This is how the people, they didn't do this because they were being foolish, right? Right? They did this. They were suspicious because there have been so many tricksters, so many tricks. People were telling them, you look in the heavens and the heavens will tell you this, the heavens will tell you that, right? And then they would tell you things that turned out to be a bunch of nonsense, right? And what did Moshe tell us? He didn't tell us nonsense. He told us Aseret HaDibrot. He told us to live a decent life, right? This is earth-shaking. This is earth-shattering. This is different than everything else that preceded it in human history. That's why this is different. That's why this is special, right? If the other people were giving out forged fake coins, they give you a coin and tell you, oh, you go to the store, you can buy anything you want. This is the most valuable. You go to the store, and it's one of those plastic tokens you get in a cereal box, and it's worth nothing, and you can't do squat with it, right? Because that's what the other people were peddling and selling back then. But the godliness, the special godliness, kizav paz, is like pure gold. Hamosif beis b'china dinar ledinar, which is always, it's more and more valuable as time goes on. Ketzad efo nasan ledamos shehem yalu al datam shechamesh me'osona kodem lehem ha'isa svas ever levada. How is it possible to imagine that people are going to trick us and that they should think that 500 years ago, right, there was one language, Hebrew, right? Remember, this is what he thought history was. So we have to get in his mindset, right? But then in Babylon, all of a sudden, there was a time when everyone split up and spoke different languages. And that one nation would descend from Yefet, right? And another from Shem. And Moshe was telling them this. He was telling them the history of the world, right? He told them all of these things. How can he lie about these things? They looked around the world that they knew, and it all made sense. They were able to see there were Semitic peoples, there was African peoples, and there was European peoples, right? And your Euro-Asian peoples, right? So the Euro-Asian peoples being children of Yafet. So Moshe was giving them a history that made sense to the world that they saw, right? And Moshe was teaching them all of this. He made sense out of the world that they saw around them, right? Right? Wait 1 second. I just want to make sure I'm up to know where you guys are, right? Is it possible that someone could make up stories like this, right? Clearly, he's telling us the truth. He's telling us things that make sense, that they make sense of the world around us. So Omar Kuzari. So says the Kuzari. This is at item number 50 now, right? Zet lo yitachen. It doesn't make sense that somebody could just make all this stuff up. Clearly, if Moshe came and said these things, it made sense. Ma gam she'anu motzim et hachachmot b'ksav yadam shel mechabrein milfnei chametz me'il shana. Right? Right. After all, I mean, we have books, right, that were written, right, in 500 years old. You can't lie and make stuff up. If Moshe said these things, clearly they were true. For some of us, you can't lie about things, like the lineages, right? It's obvious. And remember, in the world that they were living in, and still at the time of Yehuda Levi, you could make sense out of the world and the yichos, the lineages of the different people, by looking at the different, I'll use the term races, even though not in the sense that people use it today, but maybe somewhat related, right? The different races of people that they saw. And it made sense. There's this language group, this language group, this language group. It all made sense. And the Torah was being given in a way that made sense. Lashonos v'kisviyad, with languages and alphabets, and Nimsaros b'shem Mishael lifnei chamesh me'asana, which were given in the name of someone who lived 500 years ago. So now I'm about to read item number 51. So I'm on page 79 in the Kuzari. Omar Chaver, right? Says the rabbi now. Ketzad efolo bikshu at listars divrei Moshe, right? And if this were not true, right? Why is it? In other words, I'll give you even more proof. Why is it nobody argues on the words of Moshe? I mean, this is not true anymore today, because there's plenty of people that claim the Torah is not historic, right? So, but it was an argument that made sense then, right? So the rabbi is telling the Kuzari, none of these people, look at the Muslims and look at the Christians. They don't argue and say that it's not true. They all agree that Moshe was real and that he gave these teachings. Right? So at a time when his own nation was asking him for proofs, right? So kol shekain acherim, right? And certainly other nations were asking Moshe for proofs, but he gave them the proofs. He showed them the proofs, and so everybody listened. So item 52, Amar Kuzari, Ela Dvarim Mikubalim, they are accepted things. I understand them. Chazokim umushtatim hetev. They are well established and strong arguments that you're making now. So you're making really good arguments for the truth of Moshe, for the truth of the Torah that he gave, and so on. So then, so the Chaver is going to bring a proof now, which is, I'll admit, it's a little hard for me to read, because again, it contradicts what we know from modern science. But we have to continuously remind ourselves of the modern science that Rabbi Yehuda Levi was privy to, and that he had at the time. He had no reason to question the history as given and the story of Tower of Babel as being a historical truth. So therefore, he said as follows: do you think that all the different languages that exist are all original? That each one of these peoples has an original language that goes all the way back to wherever. There was never really a beginning to them, right? So Amra Kuzari lo hein muskamos. So the Kuzari said, this is item 54. No, right. These are, there must have been some agreement among people. The languages didn't just exist on their own. People must have gotten together and said, we're going to use these words to refer to these things, and they made up a language. right? Clearly, right? Remember, they're all made up of different types of words, of nouns, po'alim, and verbs, umilos yachas, and descriptive words, and so on, right? So ve'ela murkavim me'os yosal kuchos mimotzei ha'agia, and you put the words together by putting together letters from a particular alphabet that each people came upon. So Amar Kuzari, no, sorry, okay, I just read that. So item number 55. So Amar Chaver, Haraisa Adam Bod Lashon Milibo Shemate. Have you ever heard of somebody who just made up a language? Right? Well, there happens to be nowadays several. The most famous is, I think it's called Esperanto or something like that. A guy who just made up a language. Which there are people around the world. There's clubs that speak this language, whatever. It was supposed to be like making like a simplified, reasonable, logical language and so on that fits certain rules and takes elements from different language. So yeah, so nowadays I would say yes, somebody did make up a language, but regardless,
And he was Jewish, and he did it in order to make an international language. So his name is
yeah.
Zamenhof.
Oh, really? Okay, fine. So now the answer to the Chaver's question would be yes, but then the answer was Amar Kuzari, Lo Risi Lo Shemati, never heard of such a thing. Ain't safek shehein notzu b'dar kolshu. It must have happened that a certain generation, people came up and made certain languages. Mibli shayis akodem safa muskemes. Prior to that, there must not have been an agreed upon language. Mitoch she'am misluya miskim al safa. Rather, right, a specific nation agreed this is the language we're going to speak, and they put it all together. Our understanding of language today and how language developed is very, very different from their understanding. Again, so it's hard to read this and try to, fit that in. If anyone's taken a course in college on languages, and I haven't, but I've read enough books to know a tiny bit. I'm not claiming to be an expert, but I know that nowadays scientists and historians explain the development of language in a very different way. But just take that all with whatever grain of salt you want to take it, and let's hear what Rabbi Yehuda Levi has to tell us. So, Amar Echaver, I'm on item 57 now, so I'm on page, I think, 80, right? So the rabbi says, right, something else. Have you heard of anyone that doesn't have a 7-day week? Everyone agrees what Sunday is, what Monday is, what the first day is, and what the day of the Sabbath is, right? This is people all the way in China to people all the way out in the islands, right? Right? Aravim, all the way out in the islands, the Arabic islands, all the way out, or the Maravim might be the islands out in the west, right? So the westernmost islands then were probably known to be maybe the Canary Islands. I don't know. I guess they knew about them, or the islands of the west might refer to England. But whatever it is, the westernmost islands that Rabbi Yehuda Levi would have been aware of. I don't know. Someone might correct me and tell me another island, but those are the west, all those islands in the west. So from all the way out there to all the way to China in the east, right? Everyone has a 7-day week. If not for, there must have been a beginning. It must have started somewhere, right? If this was continuing on, it must have started somewhere. Again, this argument doesn't hold water anymore today, because we know that the numerous cultures around the world didn't have a 7-day week. Native Americans did not have a 7-day week. I looked this up and made sure I was right about this before I came here. The 7-day week is not universal. It's not even close to universal. But in Rabbi Yehuda Levi's known world, it was universal. I'm not even sure if he's right that in China that has 7-day week, but someone could look that up and tell me. But he thought that they did, and it doesn't matter, right? What he's trying to say here is that if everyone, if the languages didn't exist always, right? People had to come up with them, and the 7-day week is something that's universal that everyone agrees upon. Why is it that way, right? So Amar Kuzari. So the Kuzari says, that could only have happened if everyone decided, yes, we're going to do a 7-day week. By the way, historians today trace the origin of the 7-day week to Mesopotamia, where they first drew up a lunar calendar, which is the basis of our own Jewish calendar. And a lunar calendar is 28 days. And it was reasonable to divide that by 4 to make 4-day weeks. And that's how they ended up with a 7-day week. And like I told you, many cultures throughout the world did not. The Australian Aboriginal people did not have a 7-day week. the Polynesian islanders and that settled all of Pacific Islands did not have a 7-day week. You can go on and on. There's many cultures that did not have a 7-day week until Europeans came and it was adopted. Now it's pretty universal, but it definitely was not universal for everyone. But Abelze Eno Miskabel Aladas, right? Where am I? I'm in item 58 now, right? So the only, either everyone in the entire world agreed, which doesn't make sense. How could that be? There was no United Nations back then. And now if there is, it makes it even harder to understand how people could all agree on one thing. So no one, there wasn't this big assembly where the whole world agreed. So how did it happen? It must be, right? Everyone descended from a person. We all descended from the same place. And we started off with these concepts, right? Some other guy, whether it was Adam or Noah or Joe Schmo, but some guy, right? It must be that they have this as a tradition. That's the way they were raised and for generations. So that's the way they continued. So Amar Chaver. So the Chaver said, this is exactly what I'm trying to say. So now he's going to pick another thing that he says is universal, which again, we know is not universal. And again, we have to understand the perspective that Rabbi Levi is coming from. So these may not be the strongest arguments, and I would not recommend that if you're trying to convince your friend of the truth of Judaism that you would use these proofs. But regardless, we're learning the Kuzari, and let's keep learning. So the base 10 number counting system that we have, all people from east to west agree on the base 10. Someone can please correct me, but I'm pretty sure that the Chinese did not use a base 10 number system. But I know for sure that many cultures around the world did not use the base 10 system. But in the known world to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, everyone used the base 10 system, right? It's questionable if even the Torah uses 10, but the Torah does not have a number 0, right? So the number 0 was added later. I think the early Arab mathematicians in like the 7th, 8th century, I don't know. Again, somebody can please someone can easily look it up on Google now and get it in the chat. But the idea of tens was in the Torah. The Torah does count at 10, and then it counts to 20, 30, 100, 1,000, etc. So that base is in the Torah. So there's probably some Mesopotamian origin to it. However, regardless, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is saying, why does everybody agree to a base 10 system? Why should people stop at 10? Why not stop at 11? Why not 9? Why not 15? Right? Why 10? Right? It must be somebody started everything. There must have been a guy who was the number one, and that person decided that we have a 7-day week and we have a base 10 counting system, and the rest of the world is all descended from him. Omar Kuzari, Ketzad lo yifkom be'amunas chazos, right? I'm in paragraph number 60, right? Why is it not that I can disprove you with the following? They say that the people in India, they have buildings and they have traditions that they say go back for hundreds of thousands of years, right? So the people in India claim that they have a history that goes back way longer than your 5,000 or 4,500, whatever, it doesn't matter, right? Years, right? Nowadays, close to 6,000 years, whatever. But so how is it that they have these histories and traditions? So again, you and I would give different answers to this, knowing what we know in 2025. I know I said this a million times, but we're learning the Kuzari. So the Kuzari says in item 61, the paragraph, there Amar Chaver. So the Chaver answers, the rabbi answers as follows. It would be a problem with my belief system, with what I'm telling you. If you can prove to me, Sefer. So here is where this becomes a little bit of a flaw in the Kuzari's argument. And it's a flaw that you don't really find if you follow the Maimonidean philosophy, right? And that is the Rambam's way, right? In other words, he's telling you here that I would have a problem with my Amunah, right? With my faith, if you would prove to me that the world is more than 6,000 years old. do you think that holds water today in 2025? I hope not, right? Because it certainly doesn't make a flaw in my faith. And that's why Rambam's addendum to this book, which was written 2 generations later, only a little bit later, is so important to us, because the Rambam doesn't have that flaw, right? The Rambam tells you, if something proves, if it's proven to you through true, good, solid historical scientific research or experimental proof, then you need to go back to the Torah and see if you're really understanding it properly. But the Chaver here is saying, my belief, I'm reading from Korupkin's English, my belief would be undermined if this information came from a truly reputable nation. He's saying the Indians, who are they? They don't know what they're talking about, right? You're not saying it from a real thing or from a universally accepted book which contained concrete numerical data. Show me the math, right? Then I'll take it, right? The Incas, those call, but that's not the way it is at all. Elohim Uma Mufkaris, they're a nation. Just a Mishka Babel. They're a nation. They're free. They do whatever they want. They're not following the rules, right? They don't know what the truth is. You can't trust them, right? They say things because they want to prove us wrong. They want to show that you religious people, you guys, you Muslims, you Christians, you Jews, you're all wrong. You have it all wrong, right? That's why they put up all of their idols, right? And their charms, and all of their trickeries and their sayings. And they say that all of this magic is helping them. They laugh at us when we say we have a book that's the word of God. Right? It's true that they have some books, right? That a few people wrote. They have a few books, right? And people that are of weak mind can be convinced by their books, right? You can also find books about astrology, which also tell us about how the world is tens of thousands of years old. Like the Nabatean, that this book was actually quoted by the Rambam too. The Nabatean, I forgot what it's called. Does he bring it down at the bottom? The Nabatean Book of Agriculture, whatever. It also has the world being older. Mitsuyanim Bosh Moseim Shel Yan Bushad Tigris Vuduani. He's quoting different people. I don't know who these people are. Jan Bushar, Sagrit, and Ronan, whatever, who supposedly lived that lived before Adam. They write all kinds of silly things. You don't believe them. We don't have to deal with those books and those works. All right. I mean, there are going to be things in the Sefer that I'm not going to go into it too much. We will, and I'd be more than happy to have more discussions, because some of these things just don't work anymore. But I'm trying to still bring out to you a more modern. If we update the arguments a little bit, there's still a lot of meaning behind these arguments, and I want to update it in a way that we're almost out of time. Well, we are out of time. I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was just going on and on. A lot of it is because I want to get away from these arguments that are very challenging to read, because there's a lot more interesting philosophy as we go on through the book, which is going to be meaningful. But this is also very, very important stuff. And this is the conversation. This is the conversation that a rabbi in the imagined 7th or 8th century is having with the Khazar king. So I'm going to stop here at item 62. That's where we're going to start from next time. And we'll get into a little bit of racism soon too, which is not going to be fun, but it is what it is. So let me just open the floor, because I know there's probably people that have thoughts that they would like to share, questions they would like to ask. But go ahead and fire away.
So to update this, if this was happening today, and you're the Chaver, what do you say what arguments do you use that are still valid?
So first of all, I would stick to things that, at least based on the science and history that we now know, right, are valid, are true, right? Now, I will start with an acknowledgement that we may find out in 10 years that what I'm telling you might be wrong, right? But I wouldn't use arguments that are scientifically and historically not acceptable, right? That's the first thing I would do, right? And I just said what I would not do. I didn't say what I would do, right? But I don't think you have to look at Jewish history and use these types of arguments to make a very compelling argument that the Jews are a special people and have a special relationship with God. And I did kind of lay that out already tonight, and I'm going to continue to do that, right? I don't have to tell you that the whole world counts by base 10 to convince you of that. I could tell you that look at the influence that we've had on the entire world around us, for positive, for good. Despite what you'll see the anti-Semites telling us about how terrible we are and how miserable Jews are, the fact still remains that the incredible amount of influence for good that we've been for the last 2,000 years on the world around us is something unmatched by any other group, right? And this is it comes from our special relationship with God. The teachings that we learn and study, the Torah that we observe and keep, is the basis and the foundation for what makes us special and makes us unique, right? The whole world is not jealous of us for no reason, right? I mean, the whole world doesn't constantly talk about the Jews this and the Jews that, unfortunately, usually in a negative light. But look at everything. I mean, there isn't a single thing that you can't say was not inspired by either Judaism or religions that were inspired by Judaism, right? And our history, just look at what we've been through. No matter how much we've been through, no matter how much we lived through, no matter how much we suffered through, and no matter what historical circumstances we're in, we still managed to try to live lives and build cultures that were based on ideals that all of humanity wants to emulate and follow, those that want to be good, of course, you know. So that's the kind of argument that I would make if I wanted to argue why the Jews are special. If I was trying to convince somebody to join the Jewish people, which is what this rabbi is doing for this Khazar king, then that would be the argument that I would take. And I don't think it's that much different than what than what Rabbi Yehuda Levi is saying, because I am looking at real history that we know. Let's look at real history, not made up history, or not the history that you learn in college that completely ignores the existence of Jews, right? You know, if you go to any college, you learn Western civilization. I know, because I did learn Western civilization in high school and in college. And you learn all about the history of the Greeks and the Romans and this and that. And then the only thing you hear about Jews is like the second to last chapter. There was a Holocaust and they killed Jews. And then a few years later, they established the state of Israel. And then they go on. And that's it. You know, meanwhile, we were there the whole time, you know, influencing and pushing the world to a better place. You know, I'm not saying we were always perfect, but if you really study Jewish history, it's remarkable. It's truly remarkable. I mean, that would be the argument that I would take if I was debating or discussing with somebody who really wants to know the truth, you know. Anyway, I see there's another hand. Yosef.
I just want to say exactly about that. More than 100 years ago, Yimach Shimoynik said that consciousness is the invention of the Jews, and it's divine providence. Even though he didn't believe in God, it's divine providence that put him in charge to eradicate this moral compass and consciousness that the Jews had invented. And so that's how evil works. But we now know that,
You mean
you know,
conscience,
like you said,
right? Right. Yeah. No, it's true. It's something that the people that hate us and the few that love us know and understand, you know, what we've stood for throughout history.
So
you know, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I was going to say, how do you square the fact that we're not a proselytizing religion, and yet the rabbi is sort of proselytizing and convincing this guy to become Jewish? I mean, it seems that that's contradictory to what I've always heard in terms of the way we approach other people in terms of our religion?
Well, first of all, remember this rabbi. It didn't really have a choice, right? The king pulled him out. It's not like nowadays where they invite you to a debate and you can say no, you know. So he was asked to go to the king to make this argument. So he doesn't really have a choice in the matter. He has to go to the king, and it's not like and he was asked and he was told to present the Jewish argument. And he does choose a very exceptionalist argument, right? Making this relationship that the Jews have with God special, as opposed to the klipot, the shells, right? And it's not coincidental that the Kabbalists that followed very soon on the heels of Rabbi Levi's book, right, in the history of Jewish thought, use the term klipot, right? Shells. It didn't happen out of nowhere, right? To refer to the little bits of evil that are lying around the world, right? Yeah. We'll get a better idea as we go through of how Rabbi Yehuda Halevi understands the influence of Jews on the rest of the world and what our special relationship with God is. But the fact that he's an exceptionalist and looks at Jews as having a special divine characteristic that other people do not have is incontrovertible. We saw it several times already, and we're only a few lectures in, right? We saw how he mentioned that a convert can join, but they'll never be the same, which is a very highly controversial statement, which did not become accepted in most Jewish, most the Kabbalists, even though they followed in his heels to a large degree, that was not taken up by them. We can talk about that another time, but it's well accepted that a convert is the same level as a regular Jew, right? But that's what he said. So, I don't want to deny that he said it. And we also just saw what he said today, that this special bit of godliness is something that only we have and the rest of the world does not, right? And these are ideas that originated in the Kuzari and became very well known and accepted in Judaism in many circles. I'm sure you've heard those ideas, right? If someone in here didn't, then correct me. But if you've been to synagogue enough, if you heard enough lectures and speeches, you've heard these ideas, and they're very different from Rambam's ideas, right? But that's why we're learning this, because I want you to know where all this stuff comes from. I do want to mention that I know I'm way over time, but I want to mention something that we're not going to solve now, but I'm going to put this idea out here. During the golden age of Spain, right, which is the time within which both the Rambam and wrote his Moreh Nevuchim that we studied together before, and the Rabbi Levi wrote the Kuzari, right? There was those two deeply influenced the development of Jewish thought to this day. Literally, the reverberations continue to this day. And if you have a debate by the next Shabbos table, you'll hear these ideas bounced around with people not even knowing where they came from. But these are just the basic ideas that we discussed. But there's another school of thought that also came about from this time period. And that's the early Spanish Kabbalists, right? The origin of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, a little bit later than this. It was a generation or two later, but probably already at the time, the kernels of the groups that ended up producing the Zohar, or if you believe the Zohar as ancient, revealing the Zohar to us, right? But certainly, regardless of when the Zohar was actually written, it became well known and popularized very soon on the heels of these two books. And it also was a product of the golden age of Spain. And it's impossible to overstate the influence that the Zohar and Kabbalah has had on even mainstream Judaism, right? So I want to, I'm thinking about this, but it's going to be a couple of years before we get there. But after we learn the Kuzari, I would like for those of you that have been attending these classes until now with Rambam and Kuzari to figure out a way to teach the basics of Kabbalah as it was produced by the Spanish Kabbalists. Because the Spanish Kabbalists were the ones who really introduced and made Kabbalah into a mainstream Jewish idea. I'm not saying it didn't have origins prior to that, just like Rabbi Yehuda Levi's ideas have origins in the Gemara and Mishnah and so on, and Rambam's ideas also have origins in Chazal and so on, but so did the Kabbalists. But the way it was produced and packaged and disseminated from that golden age in Spain has had a profound impact on everything that we do. And I really would like, and at the rate we're going, we're probably looking at another 7, 8 years probably. God willing, we'll all be together for all those years. But I want you to walk out understanding this, how important this time period in history was, and what this milieu, this incredibly rich time in Jewish thought, when when we were influenced by all the different influences around us, and we managed to produce the Judaism that we all know today, right? And I don't know how to teach Kabbalah because there isn't a single text. It doesn't work. It's not like the Kuzari and the Mornevuchim that I can pick a text. Maybe we can do the Zohar, but I don't know if that really will quite cut it. So I'm thinking about it, but it has to be done. It's crucial that we do it, right? Because I really want you all to walk out of this realizing the incredible wealth of the incredible range of thought that's within traditional Judaism. All of these thoughts, right, from right to left, top to bottom, they're all within the canon, right, of traditional Jewish thinking and philosophy, and they're very different. They're very different approaches. And when we live through and navigate through our modern lives, sometimes this speaks to us, sometimes that speaks to us. Some of us lean more this way, some of us lean more that way, but they're all part of our tradition. And I really would like for everyone to really appreciate that. And I hope that even though we've only just started the Kuzari, you're starting to see what I mean, how different this is from the Maimonidean approach. And some of you will get one better, and some of you like the other better, and some of us, like myself, will today like this and tomorrow like that, But and we're gonna. I really would like to touch on mysticism as well, because I think it's crucial. Anyway, I'm way ahead of myself and I'm way over my time, but I just wanted to put it out there, maybe encourage people to think a little bit about it. And I sleep on this. I've been talking to my father about it a lot, like how to teach this, how to teach Kabbalah in this way, and it's not easy. There is no book really to draw upon other than the Zohar, but the Zohar is structured in a very different kind of way. But we'll see. Anyway.
So when is the next class?
Okay, so obviously a good question. I'm pretty sure that we can't do this for the next 4 weeks, right? Because next week is Matzai Rosh Hashanah, right? It's Tuesday, Wednesday is Rosh Hashanah, right? So, and then the week after that is Kol Nidre night, right? So we're not going to do it then. And then we have the 2 nights are Sukkot, the Matzai Sukkot and Simchas Torah. So I'm thinking our next shot is going to have to be, so that's 1, 2, 3. So we're looking at October 22nd, right? So we have a lot of time to think about these things, but so we're going to have a 4-week break. But now as we go into the high holidays, hopefully the things that we've all learned together over these last few years, or even if you were only with me for a few weeks, it doesn't matter, will help, give you a little bit more of a perspective on what you learn, what you read, what you hear, what you see, what you talk about. It'll give you a much more grounded perspective on our religion. I mean, this is our religion, so we should know it. All right. So have a wonderful evening and K'tiva Ch'dima Tova.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, all.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.